It's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Rob Engle. As you've all read, he won the Nobel Prize in 2003 for developing the ARCH model. That sounds really abstract, but what it really is, it's understanding volatility, short-term risk and volatility in asset prices. Now, I asked Rob before to tell sort of a little anecdote, to be able to take a little anecdote about the prize. So I'll share three things with you. So the first thing is he actually got the call from Stockholm while he was in Annecy, so in France, in the same time zone. And apparently they told him, you have 5 minutes before we go public. And the question was, what did he do in those 5 minutes? And he actually called his mother, and he called his mother-in-law, which I thought was very interesting. Now, I'll not tell you what they said. Now, the other thing that he told me is when you mention this anecdote, tell people it wasn't just me, it was a team effort. I did this with Marianne, his wife, who's here today. And then he said, I got the prize, and then I said, is what I did, is that really important? He got the prize, yeah. But then he said, it's about short-term risk, and what's really much more important is long-term risk. And what is long-term risk? Climate. And that's how he got into it. And that was a great decision. And we are really, truly honored. And it's a great pleasure, Rob, that you are going to share your thoughts with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Marco. Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Ambassador, Chairman of CGEI. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I'm an academic, but I'm interested in the way we work with businesses, we work with government to try to achieve the kinds of targets that we've been talking about that were formulated by the Paris Agreement, and which remain a little bit elusive, but promising on the horizon. So I've called my talk today Climate Risk. And of course, what is a risk? A risk is something that's in the future. It's a bad event in the future. It could happen sooner, it could happen later, it might not happen at all, and we have to make decisions today. Risk managers, every corporation now has risk managers, even a team of risk managers. This is a common way to think about the complexity of our world. What do we know? Well, science knows that if the energy coming to the Earth is greater than the energy escaping from the Earth is going to get warmer. The layer of greenhouse gases around the Earth is now trapping heat that would not have been trapped over the last 1,000,000 years because we didn't have as much CO2 in the atmosphere. And this rapid increase in CO2 is really due to the rate at which we are burning fossil fuels. These fossil fuels are left over from millions of years when the sun provided energy to plants, the plants decayed, fell to the ground in the bottom of the ocean, and formed our fossil fuels. So we are reburning those. The total carbon on the planet has really not changed, but it's changed so it's not so much in the ground, it's more in the air. As the planet warms, as you well know, the glaciers will melt, the sea will rise, weather patterns change, droughts and floods occur in different locations. And these changes that we're seeing today are really unprecedented over human history. However, before humans were here, there were events on this planet which were considerably more extreme than what we see today. CO2 levels were higher. There was no ice cap. The sea was covered lots of the land we live on, and many sea species became extinct because of the very high temperatures that were on Earth. So my hunch is that the planet will probably survive what we are doing to it, but we might not. So this is a risk. It's a long-term risk. Maybe we're talking about millions of years, but really that's not the case anymore. We're talking about dozens of years. And a long-term risk is an event which happens potentially in the future. And that is why we're interested today, because we want to know how those risks are affecting our behavior. It's today we need to talk about, not the future. But we have to take it into account as we think about this. So these kinds of risks we call physical risks, but in addition, we need to consider a second set of risks, which we call transition risks, which are due to the policies we might institute to slow down climate change. In fact, if you think that the physical risks are uncertain, the transition risks are even more uncertain, because there is a question always, will we come up with good policies? Will we execute them? Will we follow our pledges for the Paris Agreement and so forth? So what are these transition risks that we're talking about? Well, just suppose for a moment we decide, I don't know how we would do this, to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere. What would happen? Well, we would need to find fuel and energy. We would have to race to find solar panels and wind turbines and nuclear reactors to generate power. We would notice that the fossil energy companies would have to shut down. They would have no business anymore. Many others would be forced to adopt new techniques because they wouldn't be able to burn the fossil energy. They would have to find other ways to make the consumer products. There would be winners who would be deluged with capital from investors, and losers who would see their stock prices go to zero. This is an example of transition, and it's clearly a risk for some companies and an opportunity for others. How does the market respond to these kinds of climate risks? Well, asset prices are influenced by these long-run risks and the long-run rewards. An asset which is exposed to long-run risk is less desirable and therefore should sell at a lower price than an asset which is not exposed. In fact, what it really has to do is have a higher expected return to reward you for taking this risk. This is important because these asset prices that we see today are going to guide investment today. And if the cost of capital is higher for firms that are exposed to climate risk, those firms will find it more difficult to raise capital, and they will decline as the size of the economy. Many people don't really believe the market is this forward-looking, but if you think about the stock market, Tesla today trades at 59 times its annual earnings per share. GM trades at 5 times its annual earnings. Why is that? The future looks much brighter for Tesla than it does for General Motors. Future risks and rewards really matter in the way investors view companies. So in a series of papers, Bolton and Kasperzak, who have organized this meeting, have shown that stock returns on that the returns on stocks that have high or rising emissions are actually greater on average than other stocks after controlling for firm characteristics. That is, these are the companies that are facing climate risk, and lo and behold, the market rewards investors with a higher risk premium if they hold these stocks. In a paper with a bunch of my co-authors and another one with Jean-Luc Denard and Brian Kelly, we point out that, in fact, these companies that are exposed to climate risk have higher expected returns on average, but when there is news that climate risk is actually increasing, those company stocks will go down. Not surprisingly, because they are more exposed to climate risk. And so if we see over time that the climate is getting worse, the excess returns on these companies will be interspersed with underperformance. And ultimately, these companies will underperform if the climate turns out to be worse than we think it is. So this provides material for choosing portfolios which are either exposed to climate risk and get higher returns, or which are hedges for climate risk that will reduce your exposure to climate risk and consequently maybe have lower returns on average. So how can we reduce climate risk? How do we do this mitigation? Well, the Paris Agreement, as we've heard today, has a recipe for us. Almost 10 years ago, most nations of the world signed an agreement that committed them to make their economies emit no net emissions by 2050. I guess I've simplified over a lot of details, but that's kind of the core observation. And this you might not think of as a big change, but it is a landmark change from the previous way to think about this, which said the way to achieve this is to tax carbon, and some countries said, we don't want to do that. The Paris Agreement said, instead of focusing on the price of carbon, let's focus on the target. The target is the quantity of carbon that we emit, and the quantity that we want to get to is 0. That was a total change. It also means that negative emissions policies can actually potentially offset the positive emissions that we can't get rid of. Science assures us that if we can do this, we'll avoid the worst damages of global warming, and I think so far there is no contradiction with that. My understanding is that this is not binding, but actually we heard today that it's a little more binding than I thought, and that's good news. So how do we do this? Okay, you're the president. How do we do it? There are really 4 general strategies, it seems to me, to get to this. One is to tax carbon emissions. One is to subsidize renewable energy and decarbonization. A third way is to regulate emissions. And the fourth way, I've given it a name which you might not have heard used for this before. It's called hope. The hope that we can do this. It also sometimes is called do nothing or business as usual, but I prefer to think of it as hope because we have in mind the idea that consumers, employees, investors, and corporations will voluntarily adopt greener behavior. Now, economists are always a little skeptical about volunteering for things, and so there is a view that this might or might not contribute importantly to the mission we're trying to achieve. But we've talked a lot about that. It puts moral pressure on us, on our companies to do the right thing. My feeling is that it's a weak reed to stand on in a way of trying to get ourselves to net zero and meet the Paris agreements. I think primarily we want to think about versions of the first three, and mixes will turn out to be a good way to do it. So far, the European Union is a leader in setting up taxing emissions, and the border adjustment, which is coming along the line, is an important part of that. The U.S., after many years of only being in the hope category, now has passed the IRA agreement, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides vast subsidies for renewable energy and various kinds of decarbonization plans. I like to think of China as being based on regulating emissions. Because it's a sort of a control economy, they can control how much emission is done, how much resources go to fossil energy, how much resources go to renewable energy. And so far, they have been extremely successful at a lot of the green technology, but of course, that has been overwhelmed by the growth of demand for electricity, which they have satisfied by building lots of coal-fired power plants. And we'll come back to that. So how do you decide among these? Why do different countries make different choices? We know that emissions are an externality. What that means is it's free for you to emit, but that imposes costs on other people. Economists are very interested in externalities. There is probably another important externality we need to put into this calculation, and that is a green technology innovation externality, which says the more green technology is developed, the cheaper it's going to be for other people to decarbonize. And so there are incentives to get people to start decarbonizing because it's going to spread and it's going to make it easier and cheaper for everybody else. So Viral Acharya and Olivier Wang and I have a paper which puts together a little model of how these two externalities work. And one of the not surprising results of this paper is that in order to achieve the best possible outcome, that is the first best in a economic sense, you need two subsidies. You need both a carbon tax and an innovation subsidy. So this is an example of what you said, using multiple tools at the same time. If you only use one of them, you can't get to as good an outcome. And so if you only do a carbon tax, or if you only do an innovation subsidy, it's not going to be good enough. Another thing that comes out of this is that not only are countries making net zero commitments, states, regions, cities, sectors, and firms, as we've heard already today, have made voluntary commitments to net zero. Why do they do this? Well, I think they believe that such commitments will encourage customers to buy their products, employees to work for them, investors to own their stocks, and maybe other economic agents may be incentivized to do the same in order to compete. So these are true P&L, profit and loss kinds of decisions that they, like marketing. I mean, you say marketing isn't a real thing, but of course it is a real thing because you spend your money on it and you sell more goods. But an interesting additional reason comes out of this paper, which is there is evidence that Stackelberg leaders could evolve in this case. That is, a company could decide, even without any of these other effects, that it was worth innovating and decarbonizing because, from a forward-looking point of view, they recognize that their innovation would be used by other people. There would be increased decarbonization by the other parts of society. And the net effect is that the carbon tax that would ultimately be needed to get you to net zero as a country would be lower. And it would be enough lower so that not only the other companies, but also your company would profit. And it's one reason why we think that the largest companies are more likely to declare net zero targets, because they have more effect on this innovation externality. And certainly the data bears that out. It's not, of course, clear that the world works like this simple model does, but it's a way of motivating this kind of behavior. So what do we think is happening? Well, if we take the Paris Agreement goals seriously, and the International Energy Agency does, they draw a picture like this. This is what's supposed to happen to the use of coal and natural gas and oil for power generation. And one of the things that's pretty worrying about this graph is to see what the dates are. I mean, the peak of this whole picture is more or less now, maybe last year, but economists are pretty nervous about predicting turning points, and this says we're at a turning point. And is that really likely? Well, of course, this is a theory model. This is not data. So what do we see if we look at data? So here's total US energy consumption, and the bottom one is coal, gas, oil, nuclear, and renewables. And the interesting thing about this picture is you see from about, well, I don't know, 2005 or something like that, the total is more or less constant. Wiggles around a little bit. But the green and the orange are growing slightly, which suggests that the whole fossil energy sector is actually shrinking a little bit. Well, if you look down further, you can see, and so that means that the fossil energy would be the top of the red over there. And you can see it goes up and it's actually coming down a little bit. Well, it's coming down because coal is going down. Coal looks a lot like the IE energy picture. It's had its turning point here around 2010, and it's declining. And you could picture that going, the bottom of this thing is zero. You could predict that this curve is going to go to zero at least by well before 2050. But of course, we're worried about the other two as well. And oil, the red one, as you can see, is pretty much flat now. And so some of the long-term forecasts are that oil demand will not actually increase or decrease. Natural gas has increased and taken up the slack. So we're on the verge, and the IEA energy report says we are on the verge of seeing these turning points. If you look at the emissions of the top emitting countries, the US is aqua. Oops, it's not aqua there. It's only aqua on here. Okay, it's sort of gray on this one. It's the top gray one, and it hits a peak in around 2005 and then starts to go down. So that's total emissions by the US. The EU is now more of a reddish color in here, and as you can see, that's been going down, and actually they have moved into fourth place. The killer curve, of course, is the brown one, which is China. And that's the big problem of this picture. Other than that, it does kind of look like the IEA energy report. You also see, I think it's Brazil, which is rising here. And India is also rising to some extent at the end. India has moved into third place. Okay, so what is the impact of climate risk on financial markets? I mean, I want to talk about, I have a lot of things to say about this, and I'm only going to talk about a little bit of it, but I want to show you some pictures from VLab. So VLab is the volatility laboratory website that we run at the Volatility and Risk Institute at NYU. And it's a free website. And if you can go on your phone, but on your computer, it looks better. Just Google NYU VLab, and you'll find the URL, or if you have access to these slides, you can click on the link. And what we have is we measure volatility and risk in lots of different ways, and we're particularly interested in the climate one. But the point is that every day as capital markets close, we get their data. And we update these models every day. So we see, and you can see what the risks we're measuring look like every day. So one of the challenges here is when you're an econometrician and you build a model, you usually have a data set and then you publish it. But what you do here is you publish the data set, but then you run the model on data that did not exist when you wrote the paper. And doing that with another decade or more of data is quite, it's challenging. It makes you nervous. You say, you think this model can really survive data that we haven't seen yet? And even asking yourself that question makes you worry about whether your models are too complicated. Anyway, so we want to talk about financial stability. In the U.S., we don't think that the banks should be regulated for climate purposes. We think that should be done by Congress. But we do think that if banks are too exposed to climate risk, there will be a financial instability that would come about if we actually have a big climate risk event. And what sort of climate risk event are we talking about? Suppose we finally get ourselves to pass a good climate mitigation bill, a decarbonization bill. All of a sudden, all of these companies that are making fossil energy are going to have their valuations drop like a stone. And if the banks are exposed to it, we're going to have a financial crisis at the same time that we try to do this good thing for the planet. So regulators are aware of this issue and want to regulate the banks so that they don't hold too much of the climate risk. So how do you measure climate risk? Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about. What we do in a paper with Hae-Yeon Jung and Dick Berner is we measure something called C risk, and what we look at is how the stock market price of a bank or other financial institution changes when the climate risk changes. And we're going to measure the climate risk by a portfolio which is particularly sensitive to it. We call it a climate risk portfolio. And this is the stranded asset climate risk portfolio, which is 70% of a coal exchange-traded fund, 30% of a broad energy sector, and then short the Standard & Poor's. So this is a very simple hedge portfolio, or a risk portfolio. We have a bunch of others that we're developing and have developed and tried in this model, and they give fairly similar results. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to run this regression, and this regression is going to have the market return in it and then the stranded asset risk. So we're going to see what happens when energy stocks plummet. What was going to happen to the bank stocks? Are they going to go down or not? That's a question of what the beta is. And so if the beta is big, it means that the bank is exposed to climate risk. We're going to estimate this model with these betas allowed to change over time, and using a technique which I call dynamic conditional beta, but it says over time, volatilities change, correlations change, and what you do with a regression is you combine volatilities and correlations to get a coefficient. So if you do it on average, you get a constant beta. If you do it every day, you get a time-varying beta, and that's what these are. So what do you see when you do this? Well, we're going to get two measures. We're going to see a measure of capital adequacy for these banks. In other words, if you have this climate risk spike, do you have enough capital to survive it, or do you need to raise capital? We're also going to measure marginal C risk, which is just a question of how much money are you going to lose when this event happens. The event is 6-month decline in this stranded asset portfolio, and it's a 50% decline over 6 months. Okay, so it doesn't happen instantly, it happens gradually over time. That happens more or less 1% of the time, so it has happened in the past, but not very often. Here's what you see for the climate beta for JP Morgan. And on the left hand of this picture, you can see it wiggles around a lot, but it's sort of hovering around 0. It doesn't really look like there's clear exposure. But what happens is when the pandemic hits, it gets positive and it jumps up, and some of it's fairly high, but after the pandemic, it comes down and it's pretty much around 0 again. So the main event that looks like these banks are exposed to was what happened during the pandemic. Well, the pandemic, if you remember, we stopped driving, we stopped flying, we started to Zoom and all this stuff. So this was very hard on fossil energy companies. They had negative earnings during the pandemic, and you might wonder whether they were really going to be able to repay their loans, which I think is the story we have here. But it's interesting, we had 2 sessions this morning about how the banks have reduced their exposure to fossil energy. And it's interesting to think about, why did it come back down again? Has the banks reduced their exposure to fossil energy? And I think the answer is more or less yes. Why? Well, one reason is they may have learned during the pandemic that they're risky, that fossil energy is not necessarily here forever. It might also be that they learned that the central bank is going to regulate based on climate risk. They're trying to do that. All central banks around the world are trying to do that. But it might also be, as the papers this morning suggested, that there were changes in bank policy that said, we are not going to make any more loans to coal companies or fossil energy companies. So these are all possibilities. They're not mutually exclusive. They could all be true. Coming to Europe, this is what you see for HSBC, and you see it declined, but not nearly as dramatically as JP Morgan did after the pandemic was over. But you certainly see the big effect during the pandemic. If you look at the top banks in the Eurozone, and I've sorted these by marginal C risk, so this is their exposure, you see, if you look, do I have a, yeah, this number here says 77 billion is what you would expect to happen to Nordea's bank market cap if we have this stress event. And you go down this column, these are sorted. That's the highest one out of several hundred banks. So, you know, down this list, you see the other banks. If you look at the US as a whole, the top curve gives you the the C risk, and the bottom curve gives us the marginal C risk. So this is the exposure. You see it goes up during the pandemic. The market, the capital need of the bank goes up during the pandemic, but then it comes back down, and these are actually pretty small for the banking sector as a whole in the US. If you look at the same thing for the Eurozone, it really doesn't come down quite as much as it did in the US, and both the capital adequacy and the exposure. And then if you look at the world as a whole, we've got something like 77 countries, many hundreds of banks and financial institutions. And this I did 2 days ago, I guess. So, it changes a little bit every day. You see the capital adequacy is really not come down much at all. That's primarily because of the Chinese banks, which are, by our measure, highly undercapitalized, not particularly climate sensitive, but very undercapitalized. So they stay high, but the decline that you see in the US doesn't show up in that. And you can see that the exposure continues, but is not as high as it was during the pandemic. So what did we learn by doing this and by my telling you all about it? Well, most of the world's financial firms are less exposed to climate risk than they were during the pandemic. That's probably good news. I don't know whether that's totally reassuring. The most important thing, I think, is that this exposure changes over time, and events change over time. And because expectations are part of this, we don't have to wait till there is a storm or a carbon tax implemented. If we start discussing a carbon tax in Parliament, that could already have an effect on banks, and we could see how exposed they are. Okay, so I want to talk now about a specific kind of long-run risk, and that I call termination risk. And I made it up, so you may not like it. But in any case, the motivating example of this is a beachfront hotel which is facing sea level rise. Now this hotel, this is an old picture, obviously. This is a hotel which is called the Engle, and I was apparently here when I was 2 years old, but it was torn down after that. And it's in New Jersey, and it failed because of the Great Depression primarily, and also because automobiles meant that people didn't have to come by train, so they could go wherever they wanted. But similar hotels today face sea level rise and will ultimately be destroyed. And so the question I want to ask rhetorically is, how should you manage a hotel like this? What's the strategy? Well, you should sell it, right? Well, who are you going to sell it to? Somebody that doesn't know that the sea level is rising? Maybe. But you're not going to really, that's not a great option. You might decide to scrap the plans to expand the hotel, because the payback period of that might be longer than you think the termination period, in which case, of course, you don't get the benefit of it. You might therefore reduce investment. Another thing that you might do is withhold maintenance. That is, increase current revenues without spending so much. These are sort of short-run solutions, but this is a short-run problem. And that's a different kind of problem from what we're used to modeling in economics. So you might see increased revenue, increased profit in this hotel because it's reduced its expense. It's reduced both investment and maintenance and any other kind of expenses it can do, but it's still going to take in the room revenue. If the other hotels on the beach do the same thing, then you may find there's a reduction in the supply of of hotel rooms, and the price might go up even more. So would investors want a share of this hotel? Would you buy stock in a hotel that was going to be destroyed almost surely in some amount of time? Well, the answer is at the right price. So what is the right price? The right price is the present discounted value of the future expected earnings of this hotel. And this hotel is now earning a lot, but not for very long. So what you would expect to see is investors holding this, even though they think it's only a short horizon job to hold it. So what is going to happen to this hotel is it's going to start accumulating capital that'll pay it out dividends to these investors. It might buy back shares, and by paying back dividends and buying back shares, it'll keep the price high. It will give high returns to the investors, and the total value of the company will go down. It will gradually go down and go to zero. So you expect the market cap of these declining industries would be declining over time. You would expect low PE ratios because it doesn't have very many years of earnings to be capitalized. You'd expect low price to book ratios because the book value of the hotel is probably higher than the market value, especially since the market value is headed for zero. So we expect to see high expected returns, but falling market cap and low PE and price to book ratios. If demand for vacations increases, income goes up, the economy grows, well, you'd expect the price of these hotel rooms to go up and the stock price for this hotel to go up. But if the termination risk looks more likely, so it's shorter, you'd expect to see them go down. So termination risk and demand are going to be sort of two dimensions, two factors that move the value of this stock. The hotel might buy insurance, which will become increasingly expensive. If they have a mortgage, they will have to have insurance, and this is a big problem. The manager might decide with all this cash flow he's got coming in that he wants to diversify, and he might do something dramatic. What would he do? Well, I was thinking he might start an electric vehicle factory, but he probably doesn't know how to do that. So you, as a stockholder, you really wouldn't want him to do that. In fact, you wouldn't want him to do any kind of diversification that didn't have a lot of synergies with this hotel business, but it isn't quite clear what's going to have a lot of synergies. So you might expect investors would be happier to get cash back than they would be to have the hotel owner diversify. And finally, if there are other hotels on the beach, they might not all behave the same way. Might be some of them start cutting prices. And you could start a price war for hotel rooms on this beach as everybody tries to cash out as soon as they can. Well, one way to stop that is to use your cash flow to buy your competitors. So you might expect to see some consolidation of these hotels. So they might be all under the same management. And then you can extract monopoly rents in a way which we talk about in economics because you don't have so much outside competition. Okay, so the reason I've gone through all this is because I think that this describes the fossil energy business. That I think fossil energy firms face termination risk. It's a risk. It's not a sure thing. And I think you just have to look at that blue curve from the IEA and say, well, if somehow the government or the people or whatever they are manage to get on this curve, we're done. So it's a risk. You might say it's low probability, maybe it's high probability. What do we expect to see if termination risk is an important part of what these fossil energy companies do? I've already showed you the list, right? Okay, so now we're going to go down this list a little bit and see whether that's what we see. So let's take a look. Here's the market cap, the share of different ones of these oil and gas and coal SIC codes or NASIC codes. And you can see the biggest one here was about 15% in 1980, and it's now about 2% of the US market cap. Many of the others were lower at the beginning, but they're even lower at the end. So it's not smooth, it goes up and down a bit, but it's clearly a much smaller sector today than it was in the past. If you look at PE ratios, this is the broad economic sectors sorted by PE. You see that energy has the lowest PE ratio, and this is typically what you see. Technology has the highest. Energy, it's 11, and you might think of that as something like 11 years. If it's technology, it's 37, and that's maybe a lifetime, I don't know. If you look at the price to book ratio, which is circled in yellow, you see energy is not the lowest, but it's pretty close to the lowest, the price to book ratio. And in the red circle that's up there, which is a little not so red, but anyway, it shows that the earnings per share went up 14% over the last 5 years and are expected to go up 5% over the next 5 years. So earnings analysts are predicting reduced earnings growth. How about the debt? Well, these companies all have debt. If you look at the oil and gas spreads versus the non-financial sector, you'd be comparing the purple with the green. And these are for speculative grade. And what you see is that some of the time they're more or less equal, especially in the early period. And then around 2016, you see a big gap between them. And around 2020, this is the pandemic effect. You see a really big gap. But even in between, there is higher spread, that is higher risk for holding the oil and gas debt than the non-oil and gas, non-financial. If you look at new issues, what kind of coupon do you have to issue if you're an oil and gas company versus a manufacturing company? Well, red is for oil and gas, blue is for manufacturing, and you see up until maybe 2005, they were kind of the same, but now there is a sort of a spread between them, which has gotten fairly wide, so that oil and gas mining have to offer a higher yield. And not only that, they also have to offer more credit enhancements. And these credit enhancements can be a lot of different things, but they're all things to make the debt look more attractive. And so you see that the oil and gas has to do a lot of that, so that the actual spread may underestimate the difference between the oil and gas and non-oil and gas. This is investment. We think that fossil energy is going to slow down its investment. You see it's declined a little bit over this period while clean energy has increased. If you look at the number of oil and gas rotating rigs in the U.S., an obscure physical measure of risk, you see that this peaked for the gas companies around 2008. It peaked for the oil companies around 2014 and has been more or less declining in an irregular way since then. And globally, at the bottom row, you see worldwide the number of rigs is down, but that's particularly strong in North America, where there's a 9% decline since last year. And that's offset by an increase in a few other places, particularly Africa. One of the complaints that I hear all the time from environmentalists is that why aren't these energy companies using all their cash flow to build renewable energy? But when you think about it, renewable energy takes a lot of different skills from what fossil energy. It's not drilling holes in the ground. It's maybe on a wind platform or in the mountains or solar panels out in the desert. And you don't use pipelines, you use electric grids. It's not really clear that there is very much benefit to having using this for diversifying into to green energy. And if you did this, what would investors do? Would they treat you as still brown? Probably. And so you have a high cost of capital, and you're trying to get your green subsidiary to compete with companies that have a low cost of capital. So it just is hard to think about whether that's a very good business strategy. Instead, I think, and I think we do see this, that the fossil energy companies may start green subsidiaries, but then they sell them off. And they sell them off and they get high prices for them, making their original investors pretty happy. And what about mergers? Well, we've seen that ExxonMobil bought Pioneer Natural Resources for $64 billion. Last year, Chevron purchased Hess. Occidental purchased Anadarko. And this gets described in the newspapers as a bet in favor of oil. But the companies that are selling themselves are actually terminating. So it is termination for one of these, and the others, I think, can be doing this consolidation that we've talked about. They're reducing their competitors. They're using returns to scale and lower cost production because they get to merge these two companies. So I think that this is still evidence consistent with the idea that they face termination risk. So if I've convinced you that they do face termination risk and they respond in some ways to that, what are the implications? So one of the things that happens is that the prices go up of prices of hotel rooms and prices of oil and gas. So oil and gas prices going up and stock prices for these oil and gas companies, is that bad news or good news for environmentalists? Well, environmentalists should probably recognize that fossil energy prices must always be a part of decarbonization. You can't decarbonize without people saying, it's too expensive to drive my electric car, I'm going to buy a Tesla. It's too expensive to commute by myself, I'm going to carpool, or I'm going to Zoom. Anyway, high energy prices, they're bad for our wallet, we're unhappy about them, but from a climate point of view, it's kind of good news. Secondly, they are signals to change the product mix so that as an intermediate input to other companies, they're going to try to use less of it. And if the fossil energy companies are indeed planning for possible termination, this makes them more in alignment with Paris, which means that they may be doing inherently what we're trying to force them to do some other way. And these firms could still be part of a hedge portfolio because when transition risk becomes shorter or longer, they change in value in exactly the way they did before. So there are other things to say about this, and I'm going to just do a couple more minutes, and I'm sure I'm over time. We can think about termination risk from a bigger point of view. Countries that have a single industry which faces termination risk have exactly the same problems as the hotel owner, and yet they have different sorts of solutions. So think about the Middle Eastern countries. They're very dependent on oil revenue, but they think it might not last forever. I think they think that. So what are they doing? They're investing in ways to diversify their economies. They're buying leisure, sports, arts, education, travel, and many other things. They build these incredibly beautiful architectural cities that are in the desert and so forth. So I think they are aware of this problem, and you really can't help but see it when you see what they're doing and see the response. They're really trying to take advantage of all the revenue that they're getting in to build a future for themselves, which is better than what it would be if they just let the energy run down. Russia also faces termination risk of its leading industry. So I would suppose that Putin also would like to diversify his economy, but he chose to invade Ukraine in order to get additional resources and export industries. This unlawful and inhumane strategy has been coupled with a reduction in energy supply, which has ultimately resulted in higher profits and higher prices. It sounds like the hotel owner, except in a very sort of a bizarre twist. He must recognize that his oil and gas business will be worth less in a decade, and that Europe would be less dependent upon Russian fossil energy in a decade. So he was in a hurry. He didn't want to wait to do this. So I think that climate change and termination risk are part of the incentives behind this war that we're seeing. Now, this is not probably the only explanation for it, but I think it's part of the incentive structure. And it doesn't look like it's going to work very well for them, but we don't know the end yet. How about Iran? Iran also has a big oil and gas business, which faces termination risk. My layman's view of what they're doing with this is that they're using their excess profits to disrupt the Middle East, and that doesn't look like a very productive way of diversifying their economy either. So what's the bottom line here? Well, fossil energy firms that restrict supply and investment are aiding the decarbonization process. Putin is certainly accelerating the decarbonization of Europe. The IRA is stimulating renewable energy in the US, and so that will ultimately be competitive with fossil energy. The Green Deal in Europe is also driving climate mitigation. And China is investing heavily in green technology, even as it expands its electrical generation with fossil energy. It has set up a full system of cap-and-trade emission allowances, although this has not yet become effective. And it's a market leader in solar panels and electric vehicles, among other green products. So there's a sort of a paradox in China, is that they've invested heavily in green technology, but their energy needs are so overwhelming that they're building coal plants kind of very fast. And of course, the net effect is that China is the biggest emitter in the world. It's 30% of total world emissions, and but second on this list is the U.S., then India, the EU, Russia, and Brazil, and the rest of the world is 38%. So what are we supposed to make of this? Because we don't have a government that can oversee all these countries and force everybody to follow any policy or other. We have to do it by diplomacy or other kinds of things. So let me phrase it a different way. The human species also faces termination risk, right? It's a risk. We can't really withhold investment to solve this problem. We can't diversify to solve this problem. The only thing we can do is to reduce the probability of termination. And so that's what we're trying to do. That's what the Paris Agreement gives us. It gives us a roadmap for how to do this. All we need to do is follow it by honoring our commitments. And if we're going to do this, how do we have to make it happen? We have to make sure that the biggest emitters can work together and get their emissions down to net zero so that the technology becomes more available to the rest of the world, possibly funded by the big emitters, except that they're so desperately trying to get their emissions down that they really don't seem to want to help the rest of the world. But in any case, these 4 top emitters really need to work together. And the U.S., at least until recently, has not been a very good partner. China is not a very good partner. But we have to get the diplomacy working between us, and so that we can reduce the probability of this kind of termination risk. And I just think diplomacy and all the kinds of cooperation we can do between these 4 countries, or particularly between the U.S. and China, are really important. And in the U.S., we have just a very negative view of China from all political parties, and that, I think, is going to be very destructive toward this kind of cooperation, and it worries me a great deal. And so I'm anxious to figure out ways to make that relationship better, at least in this one dimension, and that's what I think is important. So in conclusion, what do we need to do? We need to transition to a lower carbon economy. How do we fund this costly transition? We fund it with private capital if it appears profitable. That's the key. It has to be profitable. It has to look profitable for people to want to put their money in it. Public policy through subsidies, taxes, and regulation can create the needed conditions. That is, that the investment looks profitable. And I think the obstacle is that political leaders must be willing to carry out the required policies. Only then can we be confident that our children and their children will have a healthy planet to live on. So I think this election we're having in November, your election that you had, well, the French election last summer, but I mean, the German election, all these elections are important. So here are 3 of our grandsons looking out over a peaceful lake, and they're kind of worried about what the future is going to hold. But if we can tell them that we've got a solution, it'll make them much happier. Thank you.